Coming up on Arirang News, South Korea reports another 40 cases of the coronavirus, the most it's had in a single day since early April. Many of these are part of a new cluster at an e-commerce logistics facility. With millions more South Korean students returning to the classroom from today, the authorities advise schools to make sure kids wear a mask when indoors and gives them guidelines on how they should use air conditioning this summer. And South Korea's heritage sites are reopening for tourists. To promote them, the Cultural Heritage Administration is doing a nationwide tour on 7 different themes like music and natural wonders. It's 5:00 p.m. here in Seoul. Thanks for joining us on Arirang News. I'm Devin Whiting. We start with the latest coronavirus figures in South Korea. The country reported 40 new cases on Wednesday, the highest daily number of new cases in 49 days. Of those, 37 were local and 3 imported. The total number of cases is now 11,265. There were no new deaths, leaving the death toll at 269. More than 21,000 people are being tested, and 20 more have been discharged after making full recoveries. There continue to be new cases connected to bars and nightclubs in the Seoul neighborhood of Itaewon and to a new cluster at a logistics center in the city of Busan. That facility belongs to the e-commerce company Coupang and accounts for 36 cases as of 9 o'clock this morning. As Korean students start going back to the classroom, schools have been advised that they can use air conditioning, but they have to open the windows twice every hour to ventilate. The Central Disaster and Safety Countermeasure Headquarters laid out these guidelines on Wednesday as Korea started the second phase of school reopening. It also said air conditioning should be at a low level so it doesn't blow directly on the students. As for face masks, they can only be taken off when outside or in group activities where students can keep a 2-meter distance. There's an exception also if a student has a headache or difficulty breathing. Students are advised to carry extra masks so they have a spare in case of contamination. South Korea has been getting global recognition for its fast and effective response to the COVID-19 pandemic. This time, the focus is on the country's quarantine efforts in reopening schools. The country also received high ratings from the American general public. Kim Sung-min reports.
Foreign media outlets are once again praising South Korea's rapid response to the COVID-19 pandemic, along with its efforts to prevent potential infections in schools. U.S. newspaper The Washington Post hailed South Korea's preparation in reopening schools, saying that, quote, "the pictures say it all." The photos in the article show Korean students having lunch with clear partitions separating them, and a classroom where each student is sitting at an isolated desk wearing a mask. In one elementary school, a special kit containing a mask and hand sanitizer was prepared for students. The Washington Post article said the photos show the efforts Korea was making to prevent students and teachers from contracting the virus. And it's not just the media that are praising Korea's response. A report from Pew Research found the U.S. public highly rated how South Korea had tackled the outbreak. In the survey of around 11,000 U.S. adults, 66% said Korea has done either a good or excellent job in dealing with the outbreak. This is a higher rating than they gave their own country, in which more than half said the U.S. has done either only a fair or a poor job. They also gave China a low rating, with more than 37% saying Beijing's countermeasures were poorly done. In a report on the research, the BBC described it as, quote, "praise for South Korea, criticism for China." The British media outlet added that South Korea's ability to promptly react to the COVID-19 outbreak has made the country a global role model. So far, South Korea has kept the number of new cases below 50 since April 9th, with the death toll standing at 269. Kim Sung-min, Arirang News.
Now, South Korea has been sending a lot of medical support and equipment to other countries to help them through the pandemic. The latest batch is going to people around the world who were adopted from Korea and to veterans who fought in the Korean War. Chae Won-jong has this report.
The South Korean government is sending 370,000 face masks to Korean-born adoptees and even more to Korean War veterans to help them in the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic. Seoul's foreign ministry says the adoptees are those who live in the 14 hardest hit countries. Some say it's not about the actual mask, but the thought that counts.
I was so surprised and glad to hear that Korean-born adoptees are getting face masks from our homeland.
It was an unexpected delivery, but one that reminded them of the Korean roots.
I don't think adoptees here had any idea they would get face masks from Korea. The donation was so out of the blue. They're happy South Korea didn't forget them.
However, they're not the only group receiving this kind of support. Seoul is sending nearly 1 million face masks to Korean war veterans and their families in 22 countries. In particular, more than 10,000 masks will be sent to Navajo Native Americans who fought for South Korea and the Allies during the Korean War. Hwang In-sang, the Deputy Consul General at the Korean Consulate General in Los Angeles, said the South Korean government will continue to provide medical aid and food for the veterans, and they will be remembered forever as heroes. 최원정, 아리랑 뉴스.
Out of 38 developed and developing economies around the world, South Korea's rank in terms of gross domestic product fell last year by 2 notches to 10th place. That's according to the OECD, which says GDP came to $1.6 trillion US. Down from 8th place, this is the first time in 11 years that Korea's GDP ranking has fallen. As for nominal economic growth last year, the OECD said it came to 1.4%. Meanwhile, a survey of industry groups around the world has found that more than half of them expect the impact of COVID-19 on the global economy will last longer than a year. The survey is by the group Business at OECD, and it covered industries in 20 OECD member states, which account for 73% of the world's GDP. 55% of those country industries groups said the impact will be longer than a year, while only 10% said it'll diminish within 6 months. In March, South Korea reported more deaths than births for a 5th consecutive month. Data from Statistics Korea show there were a little over 24,000 births in March, down more than 10% on year. The number of births has been declining for 52 straight months. The country recorded almost 26,000 deaths in March, an on-year increase of 3.6%. Marriages were down 1% on year, while the number of divorces plummeted by almost 20%. Time now for an in-depth look at the market news this afternoon, and for that I'm joined on the line by Dr. Yang Jun-seok, Professor of Economics at the Catholic University of Korea. Professor Yang, thank you for coming on today.
Happy to be here.
Well, Wall Street opened back up on Tuesday, and like other markets, all 3 indices were strongly higher on anticipation for a coronavirus vaccine. Korean stocks up and down today. What's the story in the global markets and Korea?
Okay, well, as you mentioned, the New York markets had a very good day. Though part of that is because, well, U.S. is moving on to normalization. And right now, even though some states are experiencing more coronavirus deaths, it seems to be moving about as well as could be expected at this point. There's no big second wave of coronavirus. So I think people are feeling more hopeful. And economic activity is, well, it's not exactly back to normal yet, but it's starting to get there. And I think another point which really gave a push to the New York markets on Tuesday was that it's the first time that the New York Stock Exchange was actually reopened since the coronavirus. So now people can actually go to the stock exchange and do their trade in person. And I think that added a lot to the optimism that the traders are facing. So there might be a slight adjustment when the U.S. market starts today. The Asia market was mixed. China and Hong Kong fell. Nikkei rose a little bit. European markets are generally rising. They're trading right now. But there seems to be on the upward trend. KOSPI went up by 0.07%. KOSDAQ went down a little bit, 0.62%. And the interesting thing here is that individual purchases of stock seem to be rising today, but the institutional and foreign purchases of Korean stocks seem to have fallen.
Well, it does seem like sentiment is improving in general among businesses and people, but things are still quite rough for Korea's manufacturers that depend on exports. How's the economy doing? What's your outlook in terms of a recovery?
Okay, well, April was a terrible month for exports. It fell by 24.6%. May it's still a very bad month, but in the first 10 days in May, exports had fallen by 46.3% compared to the same period last year. But when we took another look after 20 days, it wasn't as bad. It only fell, if you can call it only, by 20.3%. So things seems to be getting a bit better, though in automobiles it fell by 59%. So we are still having a lot of problems. But if the renormalization that's taking place in Europe and United States goes without a hitch, then I think we'll see a better month in June. April and May numbers will still be bad. June will still be low compared to last year, but at least we won't see this 24 or 20% fall, hopefully, in June. But this is conditional on the renormalization taking place without a hitch. If we get a second wave of coronavirus in the United States or Europe, then obviously things will go worse. Get worse again, and we will have even a worse decline in exports. What's worrying at this point is that we have a trade deficit for April and May, $950 million in April and $2.68 billion for the first 20 days in May. The reason that this is worrying is that we also have foreign investors taking their investment out of Korea, and if Korea does have continual trade deficits, the investors may get even more spooked, and they may withdraw even more investment out of Korea.
Right. Well, last year, as we heard a minute ago, according to the OECD, Korea's ranking in terms of nominal GDP fell 2 spots to 10th in the world. That was the first time it's fallen since 2008 using the OECD data. Tell us a bit about that.
Okay. Well, I wouldn't be too worried about it. That's because it mostly has to do with exchange rates. The Korean won weakened by 5.9%, and the growth rate last year, the real growth rate that's taking account of inflation, was 2.0%. The nominal growth rate was about 1.4%. That's because the consumer price index inflation was low. If you're a Korean living in Korea, then the numbers that you need to watch out for is the Korean real growth rate, and that, as I mentioned, was 2.0%. So the income in that case rose for the most part. It's only when you start figuring this in dollars, because Korean won has lost so much value between last year and this year, that you get a decline. You get such a weak performance in GDP. Now, unless you're buying a lot of imported items, the weakness in Korean won should not affect you all that much. But rather, the crucial problem is that Korean growth rate was low last year, only 2.0% in real terms, and we need to grow more. But this year, because of the coronavirus, because of the global shutdown, we will probably be facing a negative growth rate, most likely, and that's not going to do us much good. We may, at the end of the year, actually rise in the ranking a little bit, but not because the Korean economy did well, but rather other economies did worse.
Indeed, that's looking more and more like the case. All right, Professor Young, we'll have to leave it there for now. Thanks so much for making time today.
Thank you.
Now, tourist sites in Korea are opening back up, and so are major cultural events. The Cultural Heritage Administration started a campaign that'll go across the country on 7 different routes to promote domestic tourism and Korea's heritage. Our Choi Jung-yun, who was on site for the start of the campaign, explains.
With COVID-19 seemingly under control in the country, South Korea has set up a cultural campaign to highlight Korean heritage and promote domestic tourism. The so-called Visit Korean Heritage campaign introduces 7 routes that tie together heritage sites by region and theme.
Even though there are many marvelous heritage sites, they're nothing if not visited. It's important to link their legacy with a travel course so that tourists feel it's easy to access and can fully experience their historical value.
The first course is the Golden Era route, which centers on Gyeongsangbuk-do province where Gyeongju, the Silla Kingdom's capital for 1,000 years, is located. This course focuses on discovering the spirit of Korea by tracing the history of Buddhism and Confucianism in the country. With the Antiquity route, one can sneak a peek of Korea's ancient culture, religion, and arts. Visitors can see fortress sites, ancient tombs, and stone pagodas from 2,000 years ago. The folk music route visits the homes of traditional music such as pansori, the epic chant, and gangangsule, a dance where people hold hands in a circle. Other courses track the natural wonders of Jeju Island, the royal palaces and structures of the Joseon dynasty, as well as the Buddhist temples and monasteries hidden in Korea's mountains.
All the courses can be done in 3 to 4 days, and there's a relatively low risk of infections as cultural heritage sites are outside, so people can keep a safe distance.
As well as the courses, regions around Korea are also restarting festivals and events so that people can experience the country's intangible cultural assets in person. These events, which had been postponed due to COVID-19, include performances at royal palaces and fashion shows featuring traditional Korean clothing. Containing more specific information, a guidebook will be distributed to tourists in 4 different languages, and a wide range of cultural content will be shared on social media. 최정윤, 아리랑 뉴스.
And that brings us to the end of this newscast. Thank you for watching. More live news coming your way at 7 p.m. Korea time.